So yeah, thank you again for joining us for today's panel discussion on the topic growing up in times of crisis, biosocial and evolutionary reflections on the impact of adverse life experiences on later life. So you see that our focus here is really an interdisciplinary one. We want to engage the social science perspective with the perspectives of the biological and evolutionary sciences on the topic at hand here. My name is Sebastian Schnettler. I'm professor of social research methods at the University of Oldenburg, and I will be moderating today's panel discussion. I welcome you again in the name of the full organization team, which also consists of Nicole Holzhauser, Manfred, Hammerl, and Willführ, who are also present here today virtually. Yes, and I'm very glad that we were able to win you, our panelists, who are renowned experts in various disciplines that we want to bring together here today, or at least various specializations within the same disciplines sometimes. And first, I wish to welcome Ulrike Zartler. You're professor of family sociology at the University of Vienna, where you also obtained your PhD and habilitation in sociology. I mean, with many stations and in different countries, I've seen research stays in between. And you're an expert on topics in family and life course sociology, with a particular focus, if I understand correctly, on childhood, adolescence, and divorce. And I think there were one or two topics that I left out that are also important, but I picked out the ones that I found very pertinent for today's discussion. And as a family sociologist, you have contributed several books in family sociology and are a regular contributor to international journals in family and childhood sociology, like the Journal of Family Research, Childhood, Children and Society, and the Journal of Marriage and the Family. You're also an expert in qualitative research methods and have also published on research methods in methodological journals. And besides, I think, several ongoing projects, you are the PI of the COFAM study, I think, which may be very relevant for what we talk about today. It's a qualitative longitudinal study on several aspects of the corona situation and what it means for life in families with children at kindergarten or school age. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, last but not least, I said it earlier, but for the context today, it might be worth mentioning that you're also vice president of one of today's host organizations, the Austrian Sociological Association. So thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks. We'd also like to welcome Felix Tropf, and with a PhD in sociology from the University of Groningen. You've been now professor of social science genetics since 2019 at l'École nationale de la statistique et de l'administration économique and at the Center for Research in Economics and Statistics in Paris. You're also an associate member of Nuffield College at Oxford University. Yeah, and with a background too in life course sociology and social demography, you have contributed to the forefront of social science genetics and published award-winning and highly cited work in PNAS, PLOS ONE, Nature, and the Annual Review of Sociology, among other journals. Together with Melinda Mills, you're also co-author of the book An Introduction to Statistical Methods, Statistical Genetic Data Analysis, and you've also taught quantitative and statistical methods. So thank you also for joining us here. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Merci.
Okay, and next I'd like to welcome Gert Stulp. You hold a PhD in evolutionary psychology And here I go a little bit, go back a little bit further because it's quite interesting. You hold a Master of Science in Behavioral and Cognitive Neuroscience and a Bachelor of Science degree in Artificial Intelligence. So with this interdisciplinary background, you're now professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Groningen. And in your current research, you contribute to the literature on social research methods with a particular focus on data visualization. That's certainly interesting for me as a social research, as a professor in social research methods, but I think for the context today, it is also interesting to mention that you do research on evolutionary perspectives on human behavior. With publications in international and interdisciplinary journals like Demographic Research, the American Journal of Human Biology, Nature, Human Behavior, and Social Networks. And what I just realized today when I prepared for this session today, you also published together with Felix Tropf in the past. So there are several papers I found where you're both authors. And last but not least, I would like to welcome Andrea Migliano. You hold a PhD in biological anthropology from the University of Cambridge and are now professor in evolutionary anthropology at the University of Zurich. Yeah, and there you study, you have a strong focus on the comparative behavior of hunter-gatherer populations. And I think with a focus on what we can learn from the behavioral diversity that we find in that you find in your research in hunter-gatherer populations, and about human-specific evolutionary adaptations, such as complex and pro-sociality and cumulative culture. Your research is regularly featured in top international science outlets like Nature and Science, PNAS, and many others. And besides many ongoing projects, it seems you are also PI of a project on resilience in hunter-gatherer populations, which, if I understand correctly, ran until 2016 and was funded by the Leverhulme Research Program with £1.7 million. I mentioned this because I think this concept of resilience might be interesting for our discussion today. So welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining us here for today's panel discussion at the joint Sociology Congress of the Austrian and German Sociological Association.
Thank you.
So with regard to our the kind of the setup for today, we would wish to start with a introductory round where every one of you will receive a question, like an intro question, so to speak, so that everyone gets the chance to say a few words before we kind of jump into a more general discussion that doesn't have to follow like a particular structure. We can see what interesting topics arise in this interdisciplinary field on focusing on how young people experience the current crisis or crisis more in generally and what impact that might have on their lives. I should mention for the general audience, I should mention that there will be room for questions at the end of today's session. So we kind of planned for that. So if you have any questions, please, remember them, and we'll be happy to pick them up at the end. Okay, Ulrike Zartler, if I may, let's start maybe with a sociological perspective. You are a sociologist with a strong expertise, as I already said, on families, childhood, and youth. So, and among other topics, certainly. But with those topics, we go right at the heart of what we want to talk about today. Although I think we know that children and adolescents are at a relatively low risk of contracting COVID-19. So let's say from an epidemiological perspective, and particularly a severe form of the disease, they are likely to suffer, or they are at risk to suffer a multitude of indirect consequences. And that would be more in the realm or under the focus of other disciplines than epidemiology. Can you start a little bit to talk a little bit in a few sentences on what we already see about how children and adolescents have been affected by the COVID-19 crisis?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation and also for organizing this very, very interesting group. I'm very curious about all the other perspectives as well. And I'm trying to give a short sociological overview or perspective about children's experiences in the pandemic. We have several studies already. I'm doing one longitudinal, as you said already, and maybe I have the opportunity to say a few words on that study afterwards. That's not what I'm going to do right now. I would like to talk about or to reflect about two areas. First, the perceptions of children in society as related to other population groups, which may be interesting for our topic here, I guess. And second, the areas in which they have been most affected. So let me just say a few sentences about these two areas. First, how have children and young people been perceived during the pandemic? I'd like to raise three aspects. I think it was quite interesting to see the children and young people and also their affection by the pandemic has been invisible during most of the first wave of infections and also during the first lockdown and long afterwards, in fact, as much of the public interest has been focused on elderly people and on their risk of infection. It was only in early summer 2020, I would say, that children and young people started to be recognized as a group that is affected by side effects because they struggle with adjustments to their family lives, to their daily routines, to their school lives. They suffer from social isolation, etc. And yes, and they also react to stress experienced by their parents, and that was quite a lot. So that would be the first point. How have they been perceived? Second, in terms of contagion, you already raised some points. I think that we witnessed a remarkable shift in the perception of children and young people in terms of contagion, because in the early days of the pandemic, they were increasingly earmarked as dangerous. We had this idea of super spreaders and of dangerous kindergarten children who would transmit the disease to their grandparents, etc. And later on in the pandemic, we have seen that young people, especially not children maybe, but also young people in terms of 16 to 24 had been one of the risk groups. So they have been regarded as increasingly vulnerable. They had no vaccinations, and even for the younger children, there are still no vaccinations. So with the increasing availability of vaccination for older people, we had this kind of shift, and they even have been regarded as one of the main groups to get infected. And then a third aspect, during the crisis or the coronavirus pandemic, children became highly dependent on their parents and their caregivers. They always have, of course, to rely to others that provide for their daily needs. But during the pandemic, that was really intensified very, very strongly, because at the onset of the pandemic, particularly younger children depended on their parents to inform them about the disease, about the related measures, about the developments, to provide for their safety, also to provide some space for them, to provide for their for their educational progress and everything. They needed emotional support, of course. And before the pandemic, these were children that had significantly more opportunities to determine their own lives. They could choose their friends, they could go to school unattended, they could have unaccompanied social activities, and now they were stuck with their families and were extremely dependent. And all of a sudden, of course, all of that was impossible during the lockdown, but also during the reopening phases. over a relatively long period. So they were invisible, they were dangerous, and they were maybe vulnerable, but definitely independent. And I don't know, do I have time to say just a few words about the areas in which children have been affected, or would you like to
Sure.
talk about that later?
You can do that, yeah.
That would be the second aspect. I think that's quite important, because there are several studies already, quite a lot of them, in fact, that suggest that there are at least 3 areas where children have been affected heavily. The first one would be mental health and well-being, because the pandemic has really had a debilitating effect on this area. They are experiencing feelings of social isolation, of loneliness, of sadness, anxiety, worries. They are worried about the health of their family, about transmitting the disease to others. Will my grandparents die when I hug them? And we have many studies that point towards increased levels of sleeping problems, hyperactivity, depression, also of self-harming actions. So quite a lot of severe psychological problems that have been determined. And this disruption of the school routines had also reduced children's contacts at school, but also all the extracurricular activities have been are not possible, or have been massively reduced, and they were reduced to digital encounters. That's to say that lacked intimacy for younger children, it's even not possible. That was quite interesting in our interviews to hear how 3-year-olds try to have play dates via Zoom or via telephone. There are some quite, it's not funny examples. It sounds a bit funny, but in fact it's not funny, because it's always one of them who puts down the telephone and tries to play, or in fact they don't want to talk to each other, but they want to play together. So they had a sense of isolation that they were feeling over a quite long period, and then also intergenerational contacts, which is also part of the topic we want to discuss here. I think intergenerational contacts in their families were extremely restricted. Many children were not able to see their grandparents or other relatives over extended periods of time. And what we know from all studies that are available in a nutshell is that children's well-being has declined dramatically during the pandemic. There were very few positive effects, like having more time with their families, for example, but these positive effects have diminished steadily after the initial phase of the first lockdown that was kind of extraordinary for all families. And moreover, children living in socioeconomically disadvantaged circumstances appear to have experienced much stronger effects than other ones. So that's really a matter of concern. And then a second area is the children's physical health, because we know from other epidemic episodes that there is a close link between social isolation and lower physical fitness in children. We had all these restrictions on free movement during the lockdown phases, and combined with the lack of school and of leisure-related sports activities, this resulted in reduced physical activity, elevated sitting times. We had much more media consumption than children ever had before. There were like new corona rules in the families, because children used social media and other kinds of media for diverse reasons. So children had lower fitness levels, often poor diets, some of them, and that's why they face increased risks of obesity, of diabetes, of cardiovascular disease, which is quite dramatic as well, I would say. And also these effects have been worse for children in socioeconomically deprived circumstances, and of course also for those who lack access to a garden or who live in cramped conditions. And third, that's the last thing I want to say, academic achievement. That is one area where children have been very hardly affected. educational performance. We have several studies, one, for example, from the Netherlands, also on a quite stable, or one of the best databases, I would say, that has shown that children have made little or even no progress at all while learning from home. And there were younger children who even lost basic skills that they had already acquired. So how to write letters, how to make calculations. And that was, I think, very, worrying. And we also see that unequal educational opportunities have been promoted by this social exclusion. In addition, parents find it extremely difficult to teach their children at home, and homeschooling is also a great source of conflict between parents and children. So that was also important for the family lives that the children led. So overall, I think that children and young people have been highly affected by the pandemic. They have experienced dramatic changes, and they have been living with severe restrictions for a long period of time, because at least in Austria and also in Germany, schools have stayed closed for, in Austria even longer than in Germany, have stayed closed for quite a long time. And I think it's great to see that nevertheless they have been extremely cooperative, mostly in an attempt to protect the older generation. And that's maybe one of the topics that we want to discuss today.
Okay, thank you very much. That's already a very comprehensive picture of the diverse consequences that children and adolescents may suffer or are suffering in the current crisis situation, and will definitely follow up on some of these aspects later on in the discussion. But now I also want to be able to hear the other perspectives on this topic of crisis. And let's turn to Felix, if you allow me. As I introduce you, you're an expert in the relatively new field of social science genomics or genetics. And I think many sociologists, including in this audience here today, are probably not familiar with both genetics in general and applied to social science research questions in particular. So my question would be, can you tell us in a nutshell what social science genomics is about? I know that's very difficult to put this in a nutshell, but then also to specifically think about, what could knowledge about genetics contribute to our understanding of crisis, and how maybe children and adolescents are different or are heterogeneous with regard to their response to external crisis events like this.
Yeah, thank you very much, and really scientifically amazing, but in general, it's important work, Professor Zartler. It's really insightful already, the introduction. Heterogeneity, as you said, Sebastian, is key, but I give some background in a very big nutshell. I think there are very big nuts somewhere in the world, and maybe it fits in. So as some of you, or many of you who work empirically and quantitative might know, more and more data sources collect molecular genetic data and social science data. So the peak is the UK Biobank with 500,000 individuals, also containing now information about COVID. They really did a lot of efforts there, but also traditional data sources like HRS or Understanding Society, longitudinal household panel for labor market research and stuff, collect molecular genetic data. And we see discovery studies like there are genes for education and think traits we are interested in. And there are also genes associated with the risk to obtain COVID. But I'm not sure whether they are biological or behavioral. So, and their societal impact. So there are companies like 23andMe, you spit in a cup and you send it somewhere and they tell you everything about you, like horoscope. Or there is now the new trend of embryo selection. So artificial reproduction is raising demographically and now you fertilize 20 eggs and you pick some, and in the beginning it was you check for Huntington disease, and now you check for education or something. So it's a topic, a real topic that is, I think, scientifically really still within science, and does not have too many practical implications. Maybe today I will give some ideas, but there are societal things going on, and I would say there are at least three aspects in social science genetics. The first is obviously on ethics and moral philosophy. There was and in general philosophy, there's a philosophy of science. There is an amazing article in the Kölner Zeitschrift recently published by Volland and Meiselbach that is extremely enlightening, extremely strong. There's qualitative research. We want to know how people understand this new data revolution and the information that comes with it, and what it does with the field. I think the strongest discourse was on the GWAS and same-sex sexual behavior, which was like the most read New York Times article within a week that concerns science, the most read of all times. And there was a big debate because there are groups that have an agenda and are very interested in the question whether it's nature or nurture. And there's quantitative empirical research in sociology that's affected, and I will shortly say something about that because that's what I do mostly, and that's, I think, what relates strongest to the topic today. So social science genetics originally had, let's say, 4 promises, and 2 were more methodological, 1 is more substantial, and 1 is in between. The methodological promises were first to control for genes. So, for example, we are interested in the relationship between being in a lockdown, having COVID or anything like that, the stressors and the parenting effects on the children. And we want to know what's the effect. Turns out not everybody has the same likelihood genetically to be in lockdown because there are different jobs, nurses, essential workers. And turns out that these people have a different genetic markup, and genes are multitaskers. So if I want to know what lockdown does or not lockdown does to you, to your parenting, to your children, stress, what's going on in the family, it's possible that this is associated with genetic effects that bias your estimate, your social estimate, that I'm a sociologist and I want to know the social effect. So I want to control for everything that I not care for, and the idea is that you can control for genes. The second is not so interesting for today, but I mentioned it, it's that you can use genes as an instrumental variable. So in social science, we often have the situation that we are interested in causal effects, but we cannot manipulate. We cannot make people smoke. We cannot take away their education. And what you usually look for is some sort of variable that is associated with your X, but not with your Y. So in that case, there's a fraction of variance in X that is unrelated to Y, similar as if you do an experiment and flip the coin. And if you focus only on this part of the variance, you have a quasi-experiment. And there are statistical techniques to sort that out, and the fantasy is that genes can do that. This is maybe very interesting for parenting, if you can instrumentalize parenting and see in early adolescence what is the effect. But it's probably not very useful to instrumentalize a pandemic or a economic crisis or any sort of macro shock. The third is key today, I believe, and this is heterogeneity. So Professor Zartler already talked about, we have this exposure, we have a stressful situation for many families, and let's control for everything, same socioeconomic status, same number of siblings, same flat size. My sister with her 3 children had the best time on the countryside with the small children, and other people that I know in Paris in their 30 square meter flat with 2 children were very soon in the car or in any sort of illegal way on their way to the beautiful south of France, because if they could, and if they can't, that's the problem. But they're holding everything constant. There are different genes that children have, and it turns out they they might, and parents. So people might react different to stress, internalizing, externalizing, and people might be more sensitive to environmental disturbance. And this is something explanatory that is potentially interesting. One example that I find intriguing, I talked with a student in France, in Paris, who analyzed COVID depression. So it's really like a lot of people were on their canapé in their 20-meter square flat in Paris, and they got depressed. So at some point now they try to treat it. And a sociologist has shown that there's strong heterogeneity in the treatment. So if you are, if you're from your personality, you are extroverted, the whole mindfulness and medication thing does not do the trick. That gives you a lot of introspection, but what you need is to be pulled out again, yeah, to see friends, to do something social, also if it's more severe within therapy and stuff like that. I'm not sure that's a super new finding. I gossip here, it was a student's work, but key is, and that's the fourth point, the fourth prom, or one of the promises, is that you have something between measure and meaningful, that you have some prediction, genetic prediction. Please don't buy into any genetic prediction in terms of politics yet, but let me say that personalities, for example, heritable, and especially if we talk about early adolescence and you don't know, yeah, my kid is an extrovert, introvert, yeah, it's very loud all the time. You have a fantasy is that you have an early diagnosis of traits. The key example is dyslexia. You don't know before someone reads whether they have dyslexia, but if you know before, you can already from the beginning have a different education. And similar things you might have with depression, obviously. If you medicate someone, the fantasy is that you don't have to experiment, and then after a year you have the right thing. But it's also, it can be something like, yeah, okay, do I need a social practice, or do I need medication or meditation or mindfulness or whatever you want to call it, cognitive behavioral stuff and stuff like that. So these are potential promises. I talked with, but we would see how much I can contribute to the flow of the discussion. But
okay.
Within these promises, these might be some examples.
Okay. Yeah, thanks so much for your perspective on this. And I think that sounds indeed promising if we can in the future go into that direction of kind of individualizing, let's say, interventions and policies. And it seems to me, I don't know, with an interdisciplinary, with the goal maybe of a stronger interdisciplinary exchange in mind, it seems to me that there are some concepts now that appear that might be more universal than others. I mean, so it seems that stress is something that we can connect to from different sides, right? And but let's talk about this later on. I want to kind of broaden the perspective now even a bit more and continue with Gert Stulp. You're an evolutionary psychologist, among other specializations that I pointed out earlier on. And you're also a neuroscientist, or have had this perspective in neuroscience as well. So let's say, looking at the biological / evolutionary perspective and going just beyond genetics, you know, what do you think could a broader biosocial or evolutionary perspective, drawing, for example, on your field of evolutionary psychology or evolutionary behavioral sciences more generally, add to our understanding of the topic at hand, you know, growing up in times of crisis, and how individuals are even like formed by these experiences in the long term?
Thank you very much for the invitation and also the question. So I will try to also answer this very broadly. And that the first one might be a bit trivial, but of course we are all part of the tree of life. So that doesn't mean that we can make use of animal models. So if we are talking about stress experiences in early life, then we may have suitable animal models that might be able to test some of these ideas we have. So that might be one way in which this sort of very broad evolutionary perspective might help and give us more insight on mechanism. Then sort of an added layer to that, and this is actually Andrea's expertise, but that is of course that evolutionary, particularly evolutionary anthropologists, are interested in studying humans in their respective ecologies, and they take a very global perspective, studying small-scale societies as well as industrialized settings. And this is a bit missing, I guess, in sociology, or at least most sociologists would focus on their respective nations, or maybe on Europe or some such, or America. So this cross-cultural diversity might tell us a lot about different ways that people cope with stress, and well, that certainly will narrow our understanding of how we deal with this pandemic, for instance. And then a major topic of study also within this evolutionary social sciences bit is exactly this effect of stress in early life on later outcomes. And where the perspective might differ a bit from how the other social sciences look at it is that evolutionary biologists or psychologists often try to frame this adapting to stress in a sort of adaptive way. So how children and adults or young adults sort of adapt to their environment, adapt to their stressors, how they deal with them, actually makes them such that they would thrive better in that environment in later life. So rather than seeing it as a pure detriment or a pure costs that occur due to stress, it might also show that these experiences with these stressful situations might make them very adapted to their environment in later life. So I think this is sort of mostly relevant to the topic of today. Then I would also like to add, for completeness sake, but also because it is an important field, that cultural evolution really studies and makes formal models about how do we learn from each other. Yeah? How do social interactions shape our population dynamics? Which people do we copy most? And of course, that body of research is very important in this pandemic, right? How do these ideas of anti-vaccines and all these kind of stuff, how does that evolve? Why does that happen? And there's this cultural evolution field that tries to address this question from the perspective of why would we copy others in the first place? What are the evolved reasons for that? So that's my 2 cents.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. I think there are also a few points that we can kind of follow up on later in the discussion. I found the question about adaptation interesting too, and we'll pick up on that. But one point that you made was that sociology traditionally kind of is very restricted in the sense that it looks at a small set of societies and usually studies the impact of crisis for young people in societies that you can probably describe as, you said, industrialized or even like modern welfare states to various degrees, and that in a way already buffer against the most severe, let's say, consequences of a crisis that we can imagine. And now it seems, and you also mentioned that in the evolutionary behavioral sciences, there seems to be a more comparative perspective being taken, looking at different types of societies. In sociology, comparative often means that we look at different countries within the set of industrialized modern welfare states. But here, across different types of societies means to look at modern industrial societies, but also at small-scale societies. And now, Laura Migliano, you, in your own research, I think you take a broader view on and a comparative perspective, and you focus particularly also on hunter-gatherer and other small-scale societies. So therefore, as a sociologist, kind of with this bias in mind, I'd be really curious to see, what do you know today about how the people in these societies that you, or in the populations that you study, are affected both by the COVID-19 pandemic in particular, or you mentioned early on that it's hard to have contact right now, on a more general level, how they experience crisis, and if there's anything, or if there are any universal patterns that we see in how individuals experience crisis and what we can learn from them.
Okay, so I'm an evolutionary anthropologist, as you said, so I am in between evolutionary psychology, in the sense that we try to compare different populations to find universals and what is uniquely human, and also I study hunter-gatherers because I try to understand not how they are different from us, because they are very similar, but how their environment is different and how it shaped our psychology in general, right? But also looking at different groups of hunter-gatherers in Congo and the Philippines, and also in Brazil, we try to look at how what is universal and what is local adaptation. So what I'm going to talk here is, in a way, an approximation from the hunter-gatherers that I have experienced and from the ones that are published. But there is a lot of diversity amongst hunter-gatherers as well, that we cannot cover everything. And I think your question has two different sides. One is how they deal with it now. And now, probably very poorly, because they are in contact with these big, large populations of settled agriculturalists close to them, and they are normally the most vulnerable populations in the countries, right? They are the ones that are more discriminated and have less access, no access to medical assistance at all, no schools, no integration of any kind. And when there is, it's from the bottom of the society. So this is actually very bad. Some countries like Brazil actually put them in the vulnerable group, so they were the first to be vaccinated. But others like the Philippines and Congo, they have no vaccination. So even with my students vaccinated and so on, we don't dare to go there because we don't want to be, the vehicles of the pandemics for them. Now, historically, how they deal with crises and pandemics, I think is a different question, and it's quite interesting because we don't believe there are many pandemics that affected hunter-gatherers in general before agriculture. And that's related to the small density of these groups. They live in small groups, right? And if they could have endemic diseases that are not very lethal and survive in that situation for a long time. But if they have a very lethal disease that passes very fast, it will kill basically the small group, and it's likely to not spread further. So pandemics probably was not a huge problem. However, of course, they had some epidemics, and they still have today, or they have more today because of the contact with external populations. And their flexible sociality actually allows for cutting the spread in a way that, they are used to do that. So, for instance, they have large social networks, and social networks are very important for them. Both the AGTA and the BAIACA that I work more closely with, they move from camp to camp as families every 15 days on average. So they don't have fixed residence. And the groups that they have contact is fluid because they don't move as a group. They move as families between groups. That's very important for learning, for socialization, for finding partners, and for everything, for visiting families. But it's also complicated because, of course, if you have a disease, you could move around and spread. But many researchers have witnessed that, and we did in the Philippines with a epidemics of measles that happened. Someone from outside brought it, and what they did immediately was to divide the camps in smaller units. And the ones who were affected went to one side, and the others that were not affected went to the other side, so they could break down the transmission. They also mark the forest in multiple ways. In the Philippines, they just use a red object or a red flower or whatever it is to mark, don't go there, because that's a camp that we had someone who died and we don't know the cause. So this is how they actually break the contact. So in a way, the fluid system of hunter-gatherers society actually helps them to control, of course, if everybody follows the rule. We have a study with one of my PhD students looking at the AGTA transition from mobile lifestyle to settlement. And the first thing you see is the increase of viral infections and the increase of all sorts of infections, because they then starts to live all in one place, increased density, and of course, all the hygiene measurements are worse because they are all concentrated in a place, and mortality rates among children actually increase a lot. So this transition to agriculture was probably a big important point for increase in epidemics and pandemic in general. I think that's it for now.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks a lot also for your perspective. And if I may, I just like directly to follow up on one of these aspects, and from there to kind of generalize a little bit, because you were talking quite a bit about, let's say, the epidemiological implications of a pandemic, or of let's say an infectious disease, an endemic situation in these hunter-gatherer groups. And I would like to maybe switch now a little bit more generally to other, let's say, social or indirect consequences of a crisis for those that or independent of disease. And there's one word and one concept that appeared several times here. That's how individuals experience stress, and what stress experienced early on does with those young people, and what long-term consequences that might lead to. And there are various concepts in sociology and life course sociology that say, there are sensitive periods in the life course that, when you're then affected by these by various stressors, that has certain consequences for you, and so on. And I wonder, on this general level, is there anything that you find in your research about hunter-gatherer societies, how individuals cope with stressors, and what, let's say, factors might protect them?
Yeah, so I mean, there are not many studies on depression in hunter-gatherers, but there are a few, and they are quite interesting. My two former students just have a paper coming out, a review on all the studies related to that. And they have, if you just do a self-assessment of happiness, which would be an indication, because of course it's very hard to identify cross-culturally markers for depression or stress. Even if you want to measure cortisol, for instance, they have low cortisol levels, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are less stressed. But they assess very high their happiness, and also compared to Western societies and to agricultural populations around them. And I think there are many factors related to that. And one of them that we have been looking at is the social networks and how they have close contacts with friends, and proximity is, physical proximity is actually quite important. So for instance, Hewlett has done this research on how co-sleeping is an important factor for lowering stress in kids and adults in hunter-gatherers. And sometimes you have a bed with the whole family sleeping together and almost piling up. So the physical contact is very important. I slept once in a household that we were 26. So everybody just close to each other, and I was there just in the middle. It's a normal proximity is very important, and from very early ages. Another thing is that babies here, we have the situation that they normally have one main carrier, right? So either the father or the father and the mother, sometimes an external one. We quantified care in small babies and under 2, and they spend less than 20% of their time with mother or father. Most of the time they are passing from hand to hand, and they have some between 3 and 5 very close carers who are other kids or friends from the mother and father and so on. And this leads to multiple points of emotional contacts that they can count on. And apparently this is very important.
Okay.
Another one that I would just mention quickly is the future discount experiment that we did with them. And you just make a very simple question. Do you prefer a reward for answering these questions today or 5 tomorrow? Right? And the ones who live in the forest, they just say, yes, 1 today. And the ones who live in the city, they say, yes, tomorrow 5 is much better. So they have this living the present situation, which I think it's very important, but they can only have that because they rely on sharing, right? So everything is shared. If I don't hunt today, you will. So we can then share food and our problem is solved. We don't store anything. And I think these are social supports that we lack sometimes in the West, and specifically agricultural populations lack even more than we do, and the hunter-gatherers have a lot. So depression is very low, even in old age, which is something that is more common here. Of course, the sample size is very small, so we need to think about if this is a real effect. But
okay, yeah, thank you. Ulrike Zartler, you have you raised your digital hand.
Yes, thank you. As we're supposed to have a discussion, I wanted to step into this idea, if I may.
Yes, please. Yes.
Into this idea of physical or also emotional, if I understand you correctly, proximity, because that's also something that we saw in our parents. I do this study on COVID-19 and its consequences for families, and in the study we have a sample of 98 parents, which is huge for a qualitative study, and it's longitudinal in addition, and we have done 10 waves of data collection so far, so we have really lots of data. Just giving you a picture about whom we are talking to. It's these 98 parents of kindergarten and school-aged children. They have 181 children in total, and we were also interested in knowing how the parents estimated the consequences of the pandemic on their children, and which strategies they established in order to minimize the potential negative effects of the pandemic on their children. And one of these strategies, we identified 4 strategies in total, but I'm just mentioning one. One of these strategies was a kind of behavior that we called cohesion, in an attempt to create family togetherness, feelings of family togetherness, also to safeguard the family as a secure place, to give children a reassuring feeling of family cohesion during these times of uncertainty and fear. Also, it was extremely important to also heighten their frequent or to intensify physical and emotional closeness. And that was also, it reminded me very much of what you said about the hunter-gatherer society. That was had also to do with communication, of course, talking a lot about what's going on, what's happening, about shared activities. So experience, really creating opportunities to make this experience that we are together as a family, or maybe also with the larger or extended family members, like grandparents or members from other generations, and also to create positive memories. Within the family. The parents said, oh yes, I don't want that my child reminds the pandemic also only or exclusively as some negative events in their lives, but they really attempted, or they really tried to produce positive feelings, positive memories, shared activities within their families. And that had quite a lot to do with what you mentioned from your research, which is really interesting, I think.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Felix.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much. I also would like to ask a question also to Professor Zartler. I find also the parent-offspring stuff extremely exciting, but I was curious, you mentioned also grandparenting, because that is earlier in your introduction, and I was wondering whether there's already research, because this is now a bit horrible, but it's not only about the isolation during lockdown, but we later talk about the political implication that there's this age distribution that doesn't look like that, it looks like that, that older people are affected much more, and children actually are okay, and they suffer from the social consequences a lot. But since there's so much disease, I don't know how, so grandparents die. It's not only that they are locked down, but they are sustainably not able to accompany them for the time for the life years they had. I think that's a topic of sustainable relevance. So I was wondering whether you have any insights into whether, grandparenting effects and these experiments, if you take them away, you might see the strong difference and what they actually mean, even if you don't always appreciate them enough. Now you see, it, whether there's evidence.
Yeah. Yes, I think it's a question of reciprocity, because you have this kind of caring for elderly family members, of adult children who care for grandparents, but you also have all the grandparents' engagement in caring for their grandchildren, which we didn't have during the pandemic. So that is one aspect that was quite important, I think, also for the stress levels that families and parents have been experiencing during the pandemic, because there was so much support that they usually could count on that they could not. And then, as you mentioned, that many grandparents also got sick or even died of the disease. And I think it was even more difficult for the families. We had, of course, some of these families in our sample as well. And I think it's even more difficult to talk about this very sensitive issue during the conditions of the pandemic, because you have so much fear all around, above all at the onset of the pandemic. Nobody knew what the disease was about, what we could do about, whether there would be a vaccination sometime or not. And it's always hard to talk to children about the death of their loved ones, even though children have quite a natural understanding of these topics. But there was also so much guilt, because children then said, oh, I just saw my grandfather and I didn't wash my hands before, I forgot, and maybe that's the reason why he died finally. And so it was really very, very difficult issues that families had to deal with. Also all these topics of disease and how to deal with sick family members that you cannot see, because you are not allowed to go to the old people's homes to get into direct contact.
So it seems to almost be like a double stressor or double burden. If you have this family loss, then you have the loss itself, and then you have the guilt associated with it that you might be responsible for that.
Yeah, of course. And I think we had family stress, because you mentioned stress as kind of a common interest of our research standpoints as well. And we had stress at so many different levels. I think that was much more. It was more massive than it is usually the case in everyday family life. Certainly you have different kinds of stresses, but you don't have this huge amount of different stresses that you have to react to.
Okay, so now we've kind of already talked with social networks and as a potential resilience factor, right? That might buffer against some stressors in the crisis, and we see that in both sociological research that is conducted within modern societies, and we see that in research on hunter-gatherer societies, and we've also seen that how this can or how the pandemic can diminish this social capital people have. But now that we're already talking about resilience, I kind of want to go a small step back, because when we talk about resilience, we are already implying certainly that there needs to be some protection, not only against short-term consequences, but also long-term consequences, I assume, of the crisis. And being a sociologist myself, I being informed about the life course, or following mainly also the life course perspective, we know that sociological research has shown the manifold ways in which life phases are causally linked to each other, how early experiences can have later life outcomes. And I wonder if we, I just want to, stick with this topic for a moment and collect what the different perspectives that we have gathered here contribute to this picture of possible long-term consequences. I think they might be complementary in a way. So what do we know? Not only, certainly not from this current pandemic, but from crisis situations in general. What long-term experiences young individuals who are going through this crisis today likely have to experience later on in their lives? Felix, yeah.
So I found one study. This is a bit more complex story, but I think it fits in well here. So in general, there are twin studies and also molecular genetic studies that show that people with a predisposition for depression, that these expressions are stronger if you have a crisis, or if you have low socioeconomic status, if you grow up in a deprived neighborhood. And there's one study from 2021 that I found in developmental psychopathology by CREST from 2017 actually, that tells us a more complex story. So when you grow up, you might have genetic predispositions for mental health issues or something, and you're sensitive also to the environment. And what they find is there's some way of two-way interaction, namely that if you have this early stressful environment, problematic environment, any sort of effects, like for example, isolation and stuff, no interaction, that the effect of the genetic predisposition, the interaction between the genetic predisposition and later life events will be stronger, will be even stronger. So basically, you will throughout your life react stronger, even stronger, to traumatic life events like whatever, spouse loss or something like that. So apparently, this can even worsen the interaction in later lives. So it's a bit more complex story, but this is something that might be bad news, because so there is some sort of sustainability in the trauma.
Mm-hmm. And you mean what strengthens this interaction is the timing, the earlier on you experience, or is it you said the predisposition that people have, that you were mentioning?
So the interaction between the predisposition and later life events is strengthened by very early trauma. They don't do it as a function of time. It's more like a phase, like, I don't know, an age from 0 to 5 or so, you are under-nurtured and etc.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. I had Gert, you were raising your digital hand.
Yes.
Yeah.
In response to your question, in response to Felix. That I just wanted to sort of highlight again how some evolutionary scholars then look at this this life course and this early life experience on lock-in and later life outcomes. And that is, in one way, that these stressors are not that should not necessarily be seen as a bad thing at all, but they should be seen as cues of the environment. So, and a developing individual has cues from the environment, and they can be stressors such as a parental loss or violent neighborhoods or all these things. And they, rather to see them as sort of stressors that only make you less healthy and less happy, they interpret this more as these are cues to the environment that you must learn from. And hopefully these cues are sort of predictive enough of your later life that when you grow up and when you need to navigate yourself in the same environment, that you have learned from this and you are actually better able to deal with this situation. And some problems may arise when you then become an adult in an environment that is not the same as the one that your mother, for instance, experienced, or the one that you had during your early upbringing. So sort of notable examples are undernutrition in pregnancy might affect metabolic pathways in such a way that when you then grow up and you have sufficient food available, then you are more prone to obesity and diseases. But sort of the adaptive argument would be there that if you would have still been in a very poor nutrition environment, that might have actually been sort of the best path for you. And I just want to wrap this up with that there are now also some evolutionary scholars that see that we should not see these mental capabilities as something of some of these children that grow up in poor environments. We should not only see that as sort of constraints on them or sort of bad qualities in the sort of schooling setting we present, but they have learned particular things in these very harsh environments that might actually work very well in these harsh environments, but these are not the traits that we in a schooling system value necessarily. So again, there's this trait that these people are developed and it might be adaptive, but there is also huge debate on whether it is actually adaptive and mismatched. But this is a common perspective.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I mean, we might have to clarify the concept of adaptation for some of the sociologists in the audience later on, but for now I have responses by all three of you. First Felix, then Ulrike, Zartler, and then Andrea Migliano.
Yeah, thanks so much for that comment. Yeah, I would be curious for an immediate, first, two things. The first is for an immediate explanation, what kind of adaptation, because it sounds more less like a genetic one. It sounds like, okay, your biology maybe adapts, or your organism to low food intake, and then makes you able to maybe comparatively survive longer in low nutrition environment. And as soon as things change, your body cannot handle it. It's adaptive to specific environments, and any disruption makes it maybe vulnerable. That's the way I understand it. I would be mostly curious, is that very empirically studied? Because there is a lot of these ideas that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but the point is, what doesn't kill you? So I think there was a wave of studies that also showed that a lot of this is selection, that in times of war, in times of famine, that the people who get out are often survivors, and maybe longevity is not too crazily affected, but this is because people who were less resilient, I don't know, robust at times of crisis, were the mortality selected.
Okay.
I'd like to quickly comment on.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so thank you, Felix. So this is indeed not genetic adaptation at all, but the way that it's seen is that what is genetic about this is that we have genetically evolved so-called things, a reaction norm. So we have a certain plasticity in dealing with the environment, and the argument goes that in evolutionary history, we have had many environments that we had to deal with, and somehow our genetic system has been such that we have been able to at least respond to a certain range in environments in an adaptive way. So then, yeah, maybe I should not call it then adaptation myself, but then these sort of environmental contingent responses those are sort of evolved responses themselves. And the idea is indeed that they serve to make you a better adult, better adapted to the environment, better able to navigate that. As to your second point, indeed, this is a major problem of that field, that many of this is not very careful causal modeling. We always have this genetic confounds, and many people have actually hammered on that some of these effects that we might see from the early environment and parental loss, that might be genetic effects. So there is a repeated plea that we should have way more formalized models about life history theory, but that would equally hold true for life course theory. Like, when would we even expect people to respond to the environment?
Thanks so much.
Ulrike, Zartler.
Thank you. I'm referring to your question about the long-term consequences rather to the concept of adaptation.
Okay, maybe we can maybe we can hold on with that then for a moment, because I just wanted to follow up on Gert's point, and I think Andrea Migliano had another comment on that directly.
Yes, I thought about bringing up life history theory, but you already brought up, and I think it's very important there, the concept of trade-offs. Of course, adaptation is the best possible in a particular terrible environment, right? But it's probably not the best outcome if you take out from that environment. So I cannot comment too much on the psychological consequences, but I studied for my PhD was actually on why pygmies are small. And the whole idea was linked to the trade-offs in life history. And that was related to their very high mortality environments. So in a way, they adapt to the high mortality environments. And you can say it's plasticity or through reaction norms, but you can also look at selection of, the ones who survive and reproduce more actually have a particular phenotype. And this is reproducing earlier. So what you see is that in environments where you have very high mortality rates, you have selection for early reproduction because it's better to reproduce before you die. Basically that's what's going on there. And this you can see comparing different people within the same population of hunter-gatherers that live in very harsh environment. But you can also see when you compare urban populations in poor neighborhoods. And then that's, of course, a reaction norm where you see that girls have their menarche earlier. So it is a clear physiological response to the stress levels caused by increased mortality rates and increased chances of perceived mortality rates. It would be very interesting to see in a few years' time what is happening. I don't know how much the COVID crisis actually changed the perception of mortality, and this would change stress level to the point of making menarche to be brought forward in girls. But it's possible, because even though the actual mortality numbers is not nearly as close as the pygmy groups, that they have like infant mortality of about 20 to 35%, I think the perception of risk increased a lot, and this could change physiology.
Thanks. So if I may, I would also like to kind of directly respond to this point and pick up this last aspect where you say that even people in poor neighborhoods in modern societies might now show effects that might have been adaptive given like life history, different life history strategy. But it seems that in modern societies, this very early fertility seems to be treated as a negative, an unwanted outcome that with many then negative social consequences for life in modern societies. And therefore that kind of reminds me about some other, I don't know, common examples that I feel familiar with from evolutionary psychology. Like, for example, it's probably that standard example that we have this evolved strategy for high caloric food or with our taste for fatty and sweet foods, so that we for high caloric intake, which is then in a sense maladaptive. I mean, it doesn't lower our reproduction, but it has bad health consequences and so on in our modern societies where we have plenty of food. And Gert, you mentioned that I don't know, I kind of heard out of your comment earlier that that you would say there are this can be adaptive even in modern societies, or is it something where you would say, okay, this is another example where we see maladaptation in modern societies, like these responses to crisis, or can they still be adaptive in modern societies?
So that's let's say a difficult question, and there is no yes or no. I mean, there's always both is true to some extent. It is clear that there are some evolved predispositions that might get us away from optimal evolutionary behavior, which mostly relates to fitness. Again, a bit of a difficult concept, but I mean, it's clear that this example of obesity, I think we're stretching that example too far, but it is also clear that obesity is a consequence of mechanisms that probably have evolved in completely different circumstances that we have now. And in that way, we can find many other examples in which our bodies have adapted in environments that we don't really have now. It has changed very rapidly. So some of these mechanisms might be maladapted to the current settings. But having said that, you might still see some patterns even in sort of modern industrialized settings. I don't know what is the best phrase for that. That would fit these sort of adaptive patterns where in more secure environments, you might invest more in your children, right? Your parental investment is higher than in sort of more insecure environments where you might have more children and you invest a little bit less in these children. And they're still sort of, let's say, very broadly comparable to these ideas and these optimality models. But at the same time, it's very clear that with the very low fertility that we have in, for instance, Europe, that this is not fitness enhancing, or there's strong evidence that this is not the case. So both is true. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thanks. And Professor Zartler, you wanted to respond to the larger point about long-term consequences, and I hope I didn't, it wasn't a problem that I kind of followed up on this, because this was on the point of adaptation. And then I think now we can go a step back to this broader question again. You wanted to contribute to that, I think.
Yes, very, very, very interesting discussion, I think. As I mentioned before, I'm rather coming from the sociological kind of perspective. And I think if we are talking about long-term consequences, we will need at least to take two things into account. The first one is educational consequences, because that will have consequences for many other areas in children's lives as well, over their life course. We have already seen during the first lockdown and then during the following lockdowns that we really have a stronger divide along socioeconomic situations. We have elevated levels of social inequality, which are triggered by these long phases of homeschooling, by the very different circumstances that children experience at home when they have to be in these homeschooling settings. So children with many siblings and very restricted space conditions in their living surroundings. That's really kind of a problem, I think, and it will be important to think about the consequences that these experiences are going to have on children's later lives. And the second area are the psychological problems. I have followed up that question a little bit in Austria. I don't know, I think as far as I know that you have a similar discussion in Germany. We don't have sufficient and adequate help right now, but we would need it desperately to try to ease on a bit of the consequences that we may expect if we don't do anything against that right now. And for example, in Austria, it's nearly impossible to get proper treatment for a depressive child. Only if he or she has suicidal thoughts, then you may be lucky to get a place at a hospital, in a clinic, wherever. And I think it's, of course, we have talked about concepts of resilience, and there are many children who won't fall into depression, but those who do, and that's, as far as the numbers show at the moment, that's quite a lot of children. We will have, I think we will have to take care about them. Yeah. And then in a more, so that's two areas that we really should think about. I'm convinced. But what I also wanted to say about you raised this issue, how can we connect that to life course research and to our concepts of life course research? I like to think about this concept of turning points, which has been used quite a lot in life course research, and I have used it in my research as well. I'm curious about knowing in the long run how children who experienced these lockdowns, and the first lockdown in particular, because it was such an exceptional situation for everybody, how they will, or whether they will regard it as a turning point in their lives, whether they will divide their lives in before COVID and after COVID, or whether that will remain a short episode. Or, I mean, I think you're familiar with this concept of turning points. Yeah. But maybe that will be a theoretical concept that will allow us to think adequately about what has happened to children's and young people's lives. I'm not very fond of this idea of a Corona generation and the whole generation being completely devastated. But maybe the concept of turning points will help us to theorize it.
Yeah, Gert.
Thank you very much, Professor Zartler. I have a sort of provocative question. I don't believe in this myself necessarily, but do you also think it might be imaginable that this stress, in this sort of adaptive account, might be something that is very useful to this generation of individuals? Like, might it be that they are more resilient when they're adults? Might they have learned something that previous generations might have failed to learn? Or is it all doom and gloom?
I don't know. I may try. I think it depends very much on the conditions under which these children are experiencing the crisis. Because we have seen that during the first lockdown, there were parents who said, oh, that's quite a nice time, and we have so much time together, and we don't have any appointments, and we don't have all that school stress. And of course, there was those parents who had quite good living conditions, who had no existential fears, who had the opportunity to support their children with homeschooling and everything. And these kids may be well off, I think. So they may make the experience that some level of stress is something they can adapt to and something they can learn about for their future lives. But there are all these other children who made very different experiences. And I think in fact, it's not possible to answer that question with one straight answer that's correct for everybody.
Okay, yeah. Thanks.
So
it seems that there's, there's quite the degree of heterogeneity both in the experiences of the crisis, and also then in terms of the heterogeneity of underlying risk factors, big genetic factors. And now you already mentioned certainly some aspects that are relevant for policy. I wanted to ask, or let's pick this up again. I would be interesting to hear what kind of policy implications you would want to raise. And I hear you that you say we need more psychological help for children going through the crisis. But for the moment, I would like to ask a different question now, which with our interdisciplinary kind of attempt here to find, you know, what areas of research are maybe complementing each other and where we might actually think of really interdisciplinary projects. And it seems to me when we talk about long-term consequences, we have these educational consequences that they seem to be quite in the, I don't know, realm of sociology, I think, because when we think in biological evolutionary terms, not every society has an educational system. So it's hard to think of, I mean, I know that there's a lot of social science genetics research on education, but there's certainly no gene for, I don't know, a tertiary degree or something. But then we go back to a lower level of, I don't know, more general behavioral tendencies or strategies. And this is also something that came here in the consequences a little bit. You know, when the topic of life history theory was raised, which deals with, let's say, early life experience and different life history strategies that in terms of reproduction and so on. And these general behavioral tendencies that might then change and differ between individuals are a consequence that affects a lot of outcomes, and how it affects outcomes depends on the kind of society individuals live in. And I wonder if these general behavioral tendencies are the field where we can connect the different scientific perspectives better than with these specific areas that are specific to modern societies. And there was one point that Felix mentioned earlier that I found very interesting. I think you said something about there's a different genetic predisposition of for the risk of being in lockdown, right? Did I understand that right? Did you say that at some point?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's, what I said, that would be a hypothesis deduced from what we know about population stratification, genetic population, and distribution of jobs and stuff, and person situations. But it's probably heritable to have been in lockdown somewhat. I will check that.
Okay. No, but I think that's an interesting example, even if it's just a thought experiment, because it will probably this will not be now a genetic setup. I mean, because we are here talking in front of a probably mostly general sociological audience. What does it mean to have genetic effects, right? It's you won't have a genetic effect that's specific to a very specific societal outcome. It will always be with regard to more to broader behavioral tendencies, I assume, and that's the point I want to make. You know, where do we get together? These different scientific perspectives. Can we get together on a very specific level, like talking about education, talking about, I don't know, political voting behavior, which is also very particular for modern societies? Or do we, is it more realistic that we can even communicate with our different concepts that we have on this more general level of how people deal with stress, on maybe the topic of personality, on life history strategies and so on, which seems to me on a much more general and lower level. Yeah.
So three things, I guess. So the first is, not only sociologists are wondering what's a genetic effect. I guess in the coffee break, Gert will kill me for saying that if I said it. So there are genetic associations, and we try to understand them, we interpret them as effect, but this is causal language, and we are talking about statistics, and we don't yet exactly. So I said, like, it's currently more for the scientists, it's not yet for application or broadly. The second is, I mean, social science genetics is by name already interdisciplinary. I think we can use and third, like I think we should see that as a tool eventually to understand, for example, heterogeneity, and also to similar in the heterogeneity research as in the confounding research, to eliminate what we are not interested in and see what remains. So that's very a good approach. If we don't think about, if we are not psychiatrists or any medical scholars, I think that can be useful. And I was thinking earlier, I found the introduction from Professor Zartler so inspiring, and I had two ideas. The first was, I mean, the general theory behind this whole, there's this brilliant study by Pierre and colleagues on that in Holland, in the Netherlands, there was no progress in primary school in education, zero, basically. And also showing that socioeconomic status, this is an important sociological question, like how much do the parents actually play a role? And it's also interdisciplinary because geneticists like Blomen say, oh yeah, not at all. It's all in the genes. Mm-hmm. So what the hypothesis would be like, that all parenting is actually just triggered in both directions, that parenting throughout the crisis is, in general, the effect of any parenting is much stronger, is facilitated, and this there are actually interesting, useful, and not true, but useful designs in like this instrumental variable where you might be able to use genes for parenting from the parents that the children don't have. Mm-hmm. So there's no biological communication going on between parents and children, and you see whether these genes influence the children's education, depression, whatever, in times of crisis stronger, and that must be a social effect. Yeah, so you can identify in that instance really actually perfectly environmental influences depending on the nature of the discovery. So this is the assumption that we are talking about genetic effects. Which is itself still these designs are optimized all the time. It's still very, very cool within science, but we don't have yet like the truth or whenever. And the second idea, this is more purely sociological, but I found that so interesting. The point, like you cannot choose your friends and stuff. I would just be, if anybody has a clue, I would be so interested whether, if you think about intergenerational relationships and you take out the environment around the family, whether this strengthens or weakens, without ignoring heterogeneity, the correlations, whether friends add noise to this correlation, or whether this actually, I don't know, somehow because you choose them, they're these friends from the same neighborhood and the same status and everything that even triggers, the correlation. I was just, this is maybe off topic and I apologize, but I find that that was just a heap of inspiration.
So you ask about particularly about the second point, but I wanted to say something about the first point, because it reminded me on something Ulrike Zartler said earlier, that during the crisis we saw that social networks kind of became smaller, and children, adolescents were kind of fell back into their family setting. Families had to be the sole supportive unit during the crisis due to lockdowns and etc. And I wonder if, my question, if that could explain what you just said, that genes of parents that they don't share with their children, because genes of parents certainly affect their behavior and in some ways are then stronger in effect on their children outcomes than in times of crisis than not, because the parents just have a stronger social influence on their children during the times of crisis. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's just usually children are influenced by their peers, by the broader social network, by the broader family network, and by their parents. And during this crisis, at least, parents get a stronger relative impact, and therefore, whatever parents' behavior, whatever influences parents' behavior, whether it's genes or their social upbringing, will be more impactful on their own children.
Yeah. So I think
it's specific to this crisis, right? Sorry.
I think it gets very fast, very complex, because The question would be like probably also in the life course stage, because in some life course stages, it's a bit of a problem because I'm at home and my mom is in the room. So my friends had a stronger impact on me than my parents, and in others not. So, and if you mix the associations, you know, you get an average. So depending on the life course stage, if you take the friends out, the association might strengthen or weaken. But I fully agree that it adds massive complexity if you try to disentangle, if you find, for example, a stronger effect of the parents on the children, whether this is due to the density of interaction or whatever, or the intensity, or, you know, like more communication somehow in shorter time or more time, or whether it's because you take out alternatives that are less, let's see, friends always have an impact, might be associative mating, but let's say less impact in a certain age, then statistically it will be maybe a big challenge. And also in terms of life course, it will probably be heterogeneous if you are 14 and smoke your first cigarette in Paris, or you are 3. Yeah.
Yeah, and I understand that this is probably something that we I mean, would be very interesting to kind of follow up in more detail. But as we are progressing here, and as we still also want to leave some time for discussion at the end of this session, I want to ask you about your own experiences with interdisciplinary work, particularly, or if you don't work already in interdisciplinary teams, what potential or limitations you see for this kind of collaboration. So for those who are not sociologists or who are working intensively with others outside of sociology, what do you see as the strength of sociology? Or what do you see sociology has to deliver more to be more useful? And for those who are within sociology, what do you, how do you evaluate the potential to take these other perspectives into your own into account in your own research? What do you wish from the others, from the other perspectives, so that we can better collaborate in the future on these and related topics? Gert.
Yeah, I can say some things that I hope may be relevant. So in one way, it's completely fine that different branches of field study a similar topic, and they will always have some bit that the other field does not have. So a clear strength for me from sociology is this focus on social interactions, on social institutions. Often it's also more of a historical perspectives, how these things have come to be in society. And that is a major strength of sociology that is definitely missing in most of the evolutionary studies, because the framework, there's lots of diversity within evolutionary sciences, as there is in sociology, of course. But there, the social institutions in most fields are a bit ignored, because it is, I guess it is a little bit more difficult maybe to formalize in their models, or because they think that this is sort of a very recent innovation, and we are mostly interested in the environments from way back, so to say. So they clearly have different aspects that they focus on, and that's okay to me. What I do think, but this is very, very broadly, is that at one point in time, sociology, for instance, life course theory, has to give some grounding to their axioms, right? Because one of the axioms in life course theory is that people optimize their well-being or maximize their well-being, and this is central, basically. And that is fine, but why is that the case? Then, and I don't think you can answer that question without resorting to some evolutionary theory. But it might be for those particular aspects that evolutionary theory is right. But I'm not at all being imperialist. I think the sociology is doing excellent in life course theory, and in some ways are more robust than life history theory. But in some domains, there's clear. It's nice that one can learn from each other, but maybe we don't have to force it.
Okay, thanks. And now I have everyone else raised their hands in the meantime, and I think in the order that first I saw Ulrike Zartler, then Felix, and then Andrea Migliano.
Yes, just very short comment from my side. I'm very much in favor of interdisciplinary work. Have been working together with many different disciplines, and my experience is that it's all about communication. I mean, every discipline has something to contribute, and I wouldn't want to go into detail, but sometimes it's the same concepts that are regarded completely differently in the different disciplines, and I think it's really very important to find a common language and to be sure that you are talking about the same things, or even you don't need to talk about the same things, but you should be sure that your interdisciplinary colleagues know what you are meaning by your concepts. And I just recently have been working together with a team of historians and law people. I mean, it's amazing to see how differently we can interpret the same concepts, which we think are fixed ideas, and of course we don't have to explain them, but you always have to when you're in an interdisciplinary context. And then just one thought, at least from my experience, it's great to work together in an interdisciplinary team, but it's extremely hard in terms of institutional logics, because they usually don't support interdisciplinary thinking and collaboration. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Felix.
Yeah, thank you. I couldn't agree more. I think that was quite, I agree with both points, and it's that just about communication. It's funny because sometimes you can learn. So first of all, it's tough. It took me 1 year, I think, to talk to my genetics supervisor. The first time I said, like, maybe monozygotic twins are more similar because they socially influence each other. He was like, wrong. And as a trained sociologist, I hadn't heard that word for 6 years. Wrong. And so communication was tough. It's like, you don't understand the model. And the second example is actually sometimes you talk about the same stuff, right? And it takes a while, you know. And some is heterogeneity, gene environment interaction. Sometimes it's age at first birth. I went to Gert Stulp in Groningen and said, like, Gert, there's no literature on genetics of age at first birth. And he was like, what's this, Tom? What did you Google? Genetics of age at first birth? And he was, Google genetics of onset of human reproduction. So I Googled genetics of onset of human reproduction, 5,000 hits. Yeah.
It's a good example. Yeah.
And you need to, so thanks again, Gert, for your help in communication back during my PhD, because it is, you laugh, but it's key. Just quickly, yeah, you also said that sometimes it's not, or I would say sometimes it's not a clash, and sometimes we discuss a lot about things like, no, it's like this, no, it's like that, and it's actually both are right, but they have different interests. For example, Professor Migliano said she's interested in the universal effect. If we do genetics, so she studies different populations for universal effects, and geneticists do that with genetic discoveries across hundreds of data sets. And our sociologists are like, oh, that doesn't replicate. How interesting. This is exciting. There must be an environmental interaction. So we are thrilled about different things, and that can be super nice in communication. And I'm also interested in universal stuff, but I'm also interested in interaction. And sometimes we just have this clash also in reviews. I got a paper that got 1,000 times rejected because it's wrong, because it doesn't replicate. So this is a challenge as well. And yeah, I just want the good news. 10 years ago, we struggled a lot. I said I'm a statistician to get into a genetics lab. And But now the table have turned a bit, like, because there's so much data and so much clearance now that there's heterogeneity in genetic effects, that things do not replicate. And also to a degree that's mathematically implausible, not due to genetic structure anymore. There must be something like the environment that somehow has an influence how, you know, genes have an effect or have an association. So geneticists, quantitative geneticists start to believe that something like sociology exists and matters, and also reach out. So that's I think something I observed in the last 2 years.
Interesting to hear that. Andrea, Migliano.
Yes, I think it's, I mean, I also worked in that resilience project. Was a very multidisciplinary effort. We had social anthropologists, geneticists, behavior ecologists, and all sorts of people, and it was a lot of fun to do it. I think there is the communication problem. Another problem is that maybe the same question can be answered at different levels, right? So we have the proximate mechanisms and how it works, and this is more probably interesting for sociologists, and evolutionary anthropologists might want to understand why it evolved. It's the same process, but looked at different levels, and both questions and answers are relevant, and they should actually come together. So in a way, as an evolutionary anthropologist, I think it would be much easier to work with sociologists than the experience I had, for instance, with social anthropologists, because in that extreme quantification is many times not accepted. So we cannot even say that there are things that are very general and others that are very specific. So looking at the same processes from the sociological perspective and evolutionary perspective, I think makes a lot of sense. And the methods might not be so different. Of course, we are looking at the different levels of the same question.
Yeah, thank you. I think these are all very interesting perspectives, and I hope this inspires and helps some of the people listening to this to engage more or improve their interdisciplinary collaboration. I think there are many more interesting topics that we could have talked about, but I want to leave a few more minutes for an open discussion and for questions from the audience. And so maybe some of these issues will come up. I mean, I said earlier that I would like to come back to the topic of policy, but I will stop now with our general discussion so that the audience has the chance to ask some questions. Christoph Meiselbach.
Yeah, hello.
Hello.
Thank you all for your interesting discussion. My question goes primarily to the evolutionary anthropologists on the panel. In the recent weeks, I thought a lot about the so-called parasite stress theory by Randall Thornhill and Corey Fincher, which to me seems to be very pertinent in the context of the pandemic, and also seems to be a good starting point for interdisciplinary research to catch up to the latest point. So the core idea of this parasite stress idea, for those who are not familiar with it, is that parasite stress or perceived parasite stress has an effect on social values by changing what they call the behavioral immune system. So in a nutshell, when societies or individuals perceive higher parasite stress, they drive more from individualist values to collectivist values, stronger groupthink, stronger group barriers, ethnocentrism, xenophobia, less cosmopolitarianism, less individualism, and so on. And if I understand it correctly, this hypothesis is quite well backed up by data. For example, there's this study showing for Germany that in those regions of Germany where the Spanish flu hit the hardest after World War I, the vote share for the Nazi party in the early 30s was higher than in other areas. So this also points to a life course effect, even though I'm not aware about how the theory, the parasite stress theory, deals with those life history issues. So the prediction for the COVID pandemic is clear here. The degree of perceived danger for illness or infection has risen tremendously. So we should see more collectivism, more groupthink, all those things that I stated earlier in the next years. So my question would be, what do you think? And this is, of course, very speculative. Will the pandemic have this effect on younger generations that grow up under those circumstances of a tremendously higher perceived danger of being ill and being infected? Or to put it more generally and maybe more systematically, do you have any thoughts on the relevance of parasite stress theory for studying the pandemic and its effects? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Does anybody of our discussants want to try and answer to this one? Gert.
I can, but it will be a disappointing one. I know of the theory. What I also do know of the theory is that it's sort of, let's say it, nuanced, widely discussed, and that's some more, let's say, fancy statistical models that take into account how closely populations are related to one another. And if you do it more on a regional level, that then the idea doesn't really hold up. But that is my understanding of this discussion. So in that sense, I feel very, I'm not really comfortable making more claims. I do think this is one example where sociologists actually might contribute a lot to those theories, because there, I do think there the institutions matter so much, and there you can actually learn if this parasite model is is true, what kind of cultural institutions then have evolved, how can we learn a bit about the history of these populations and these regions, and that is then sometimes a bit that is neglected in this cross-cultural research, where just every country is one data point, and then you make a correlation, and then you find something significant, and then yeah, well, we know all the problems with these cross-cultural correlations, that they say nothing about the individual perspective. So I don't have particularly much faith in that particular hypothesis because of these discussions. But again, maybe I should not even say that. Maybe they're absolutely right. I don't know enough about that. And then whether it would have effects, it might be that this follows their model, right? I can imagine that in-group stress arises, but then I think, does a financial crisis also do that? And doesn't all stressful situations make you a little bit more inward? So then, yeah, then we should find a control group.
Okay, thanks, Andrea.
Yeah, I'm glad you started, because I was going to say very similar things. The problem is, of course, parasites correlate with multiple things, right? Climate, economical situation of the country. So basically you can get a correlation between parasites and many other factors. So I don't think we have enough to say that. But on the second part, whether it's going to create societies more collectivist societies, I'm actually quite disappointed with the general attitude, right? For all the countries, specifically the rich ones, the idea is let's vaccinate everybody here first, and let's close the boundaries so it doesn't spread. While there was very little collectivism in the sense of, okay, let's extend vaccines to the poorest. And so I don't see this changing cooperation or generosity in large scale like I would expect it should.
Thanks. And this brings us again to the point of policy, right? So we have now two big policy recommendations from this group already. One is more psychological help for young children, and one would be a different vaccination strategy, right? But before we pick up on this point more, if we still have a minute later on, let's ask if there are more questions from the audience. Nicole Holzhauser.
Yeah, thanks for the engaging discussion. I very much enjoy it. There are two questions that come together. I think that I'm keeping or taking with me throughout this discussion. Maybe you've seen, or maybe you've noticed that last year I was pregnant and I have a little baby. And in the time of the lockdown, the first lockdown, I read a lot about these questions of how does it impact, what impact does it have on pregnancy, on little children, and so on. And there was one interesting study that claimed, and I didn't follow up on it, so maybe some of you have more information on it. It was on miscarriages, and it stated that in the first phase of the pandemic, that miscarriages went down to only 1/10 of the usual amount of miscarriages, and I still don't know if the effect is that it really was the case that in the same sort of population of pregnant women there was less miscarriages, or if only, for example, other women became pregnant also, and so on. So if there are a lot of effects that there are two different populations, which brings me to the more general question. I thought it was so interesting when I think Professor Zartler, you talked about the different stress effects on different groups from different social economic backgrounds, from different habitats of social environments on children. And I immediately had this concept of Karl Mannheim in mind, of the different generations within a collective. And to me, it more and more appears that we are not, or it seems to me that we are not able to talk about the youth as one generation or the elderly as one generation, but that there are a lot of social conflicts that come up, and that we are all in this together in the pandemic is more sort of an ideology, and that the impact is so different. Because I thought the example that you gave of these well-situated children that have parents that are not in fear of losing their jobs and that have the time to make some time free for their children and take more care of them. I thought, okay, maybe they don't experience stress at all, and maybe these women that became pregnant during the pandemic, they were in a situation where they did not have to fear stress. So maybe less miscarriages came with less stress. So the question, I think, in general, that I try to put it together, my thoughts here, is it, would you say that we are able to talk about this as a macro phenomenon that really has an impact on the whole society, or is it more that it shows very clearly how many different levels of society there are, and that we cannot talk about one generation as one, but more different generations within the youth in our example? I hope I could put it together a bit, and it goes to everyone, of course.
Anybody?
I make a start, if I may.
Yes.
I think we never can talk about one generation as one, because we have so many different life circumstances and life situations that are hardly comparable, and that are maybe, there are maybe more intra-group similarities than in-group similarities, if I said that correctly now. So I think that we have huge differences between children living even in the same country, in the same area, in the same city. So we never can talk about consequences that will be the same for everybody. And then it also always depends, as we also heard from the other colleagues, I think here, on resilience, on maybe it's kind of genetic concepts that make you perceive a situation completely different, even within one family, makes you perceive a situation completely different from what your sibling experiences. We know that from sibling research. So definitely I would say that we won't have this concept of one generation that has all the same experiences, that has made all the same experiences right now. And referring to your introductory statement with miscarriages and pregnancy, just one anecdotal remark maybe. I've heard in the beginning of the pandemic, during the first lockdown and also during the second one, at least in Austria, that there were no breastfeeding problems reported, or almost no breastfeeding problems reported in the hospitals, because of the reduced levels of stress that the young mothers experienced, as there were no visitors. There was only one visitor allowed for every young mother. And that was quite fascinating, I think. So maybe it would be worth to look into that for us as sociologists as well.
Okay, thank you. I think that shows again the intricacies kind of studying this kind of crisis situation, because it can have so many very specific outcomes, right? But yeah, so we are at the end of the time slot that we have been allotted here at the conference. I thank everyone for this wonderful discussion. I think it was very interesting. And I also thank for the questions from the audience. And yeah, I wish, as we are still going through this crisis, certainly wish everyone all the best, good health, continuously good health, and take care. And I welcome the speakers to stick around for a few more minutes if you have the time and if you like to. Everyone else is free to visit the next session at this conference. Thank you.